So if we want to, and just by the way, so people know who I am, I'm Ryan Compton with Hazardous Materials Assessment Corporation. I'm a certified asbestos consultant, and I have been for around 20 years with HMA. And I've just come on here this evening to try and help answer a few general questions for you folks. So the first question here is, what is asbestos and why is it a safety concern? Asbestos is a mineral that was used, mined and used for the fiber in many building products and many other products. Um, and the concern with asbestos is when that fiber gets airborne. It is an inhalation hazard. It is not a skin toxin. It's not going to soak in through your skin and make you sick if you touch it. It is an inhalation hazard, and it is a carcinogen, and it is cancer causing. Um, if there's anything else anyone wants to elaborate as far as further questions on a specific one, feel free to just jump in. Otherwise, I'll just kind of go line item by line item here. When was asbestos used? I heard something related to the year of 1978 where its usage was banned or restricted. And can you elaborate on whether it's still in use? There were many bans. Many of the bans did go into effect between basically 1973 and 1979. They banned different products. I will try to be a little general in my responses because I don't want to get into a 14-page regulation spelled out each individual thing. But there were many different dates. Mainly, the materials that were banned were surfacing materials like your popcorn ceilings, TSI, thermal system insulation, fireproofing, these kind of materials. A lot of people think that asbestos was entirely banned, and it was not. In 92, the ban was overturned, and it is still legal today to import, manufacture, and or install asbestos roofing products, asbestos cement products, asbestos flooring products. Until January, it can still be used in brake linings and gaskets. There is a ban that's going to go into effect in some materials with chrysotile come January. But the bottom line is, in homes and building materials, there is no cutoff date for EPA. If you are going to be disturbing a material, it needs to be presumed as asbestos or tested to prove otherwise. And again, there is no cutoff date. The EPA does not care if the building was constructed yesterday. You still have to test it to prove it's not asbestos or treat it as though that it is. Let me get on to the next one here. I heard when asbestos is not touched or disturbed, it is safe. Is that true? What counts as disturbing it and exposing our bodies to asbestos?
Oh, this is a version. I wanted to. I had a question for you about the previous question, just super briefly.
Okay.
You're mentioning the EPA requirements, so that speaks to federal standards. Are there more stringent California standards by any chance? This session to a large extent is for us about what impacts our homes here in Santa Clara, California. Is there something that California does or requires or forbids that it maybe is more stringent than what EPA, as you mentioned, does or doesn't in this case?
Yes, absolutely. I'll just kind of start because a lot of these questions, there are many different regulations. And when I'm speaking about OSHA regulations, those are regulations for employees of employers, and those employers that disturb or come into contact with asbestos. And then there are federal EPA regulations. And here in the Bay Area, the agency that governs and is more stringent with their regulations is Bay Area Air Quality Management District. And they are the enforcement agent for the EPA across the United States when there are areas that are not picked up by individual air quality districts. They are covered by EPA Region 9. Again, here in the Bay Area, everywhere in the Bay Area, you're covered by Bay Area Air Quality Management District. They are more stringent in many areas. I'm not going to try to lay out every regulation here, but they are more stringent. The other thing is that here in California, we have what's called Cal OSHA. So federal OSHA regulates asbestos at 1%. California regulates asbestos at any detectable amount, and most work practice requirements kick in at as little as 0.1% asbestos. I'm not sure if that completely answers your question, Bertrand.
All right. Yeah, this is a start, but this is good. I don't want to derail this too much. I might come back to some of it later. Thank you.
Sure. So we were on when is it disturbed? So disturbance, in some of the classes that I've attended over the years, people speak to it as anytime the matrix of a material is disturbed. Now, realistically, in the real world with renovation and demolition activities, disturbance and whether or not a material is going to be disturbed is sometimes asked of the contractor. For example, if a contractor is going to take out a kitchen cabinet, it is on that contractor to advise as to whether they would need to disturb the underlying material. Um, Again, disturbance is usually with a significant renovation where you're going to be taking a hammer or a saw or a drill to materials, and the regulations also, just be aware, kick in over 100 square feet here in the Bay Area. So if you're going to drill a hole in the wall to hang a picture, you don't need to call in an asbestos abatement contractor to do that. But if you're going to drill 100 holes to run wiring, then Cal OSHA would probably take the position that that work would need to be done by a licensed abatement contractor. And I know that's a little bit off from disturbance, but in my opinion, anything that's going to break or crumble or cut into a material, that would be considered a disturbance.
So maybe, Ryan, it doesn't matter whether you're using hand tools or power tools as long as you break, crumble, and such.
When we are talking about disturbance, correct. It does not matter the method. If you're breaking it, you're disturbing it. There are different materials that require different specialized handling, and what tools can and can't be used. They get really deep into the regulations. This is like a 40-hour class on these kind of things, but in general, I would agree with that statement, Mark. Looks like I lost part of the screen, but that it doesn't matter whether you're using a tool or your fist. If you put a hole in the drywall, you're disturbing it. If you take a piece of sandpaper to sand a new finish, you're absolutely disturbing it. And again, I've heard terms like anything that impacts the matrix of a material could be considered disturbance. Sorry, I'm going to get to that question here in a second. I'm just trying to see why my screen went all wonky. I guess I'll just work with that. So I'm going to move on. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, what kind of materials, be it used in buildings or other parts of our environment, contain asbestos?
Right. So, and you kind of mentioned this at the beginning, and I will start by saying that there are thousands of materials that use asbestos. It's actually probably easier for me to tell you what doesn't have asbestos than what is considered suspect for asbestos. And all of your regulations, even though you may get into some where you're talking about PACM, presumed asbestos material, or RACM, regulated asbestos material, and you'll see these cutoff dates of 1980, 1981, just because there is a regulation that says it was definitely used before this date does not mean that it wasn't used after this date. So keep in mind that there's no cutoff. The date comes all the way up through this morning, but the only materials that are not considered suspect for asbestos are glass, which has no coatings, metal that has no coatings, and wood that has no coatings. And even those materials can have coatings or paints that are asbestos containing. Basically, everything else in your home or building, from the roofing all the way down to the concrete, is suspect for asbestos. There are many materials that very often are proven not to be asbestos. You can never, by regulation, go in and presume something to not be asbestos. You have to test it if you're going to treat it as though it is not asbestos by regulation. There are certainly materials that are more likely to come up as asbestos, but all of them are suspect. Any further discussion on building materials and what types are and aren't? Trying to get into the specifics of which ones are suspect, like I say, is a laundry list. If you have any specific materials that you're questioning, I'll be happy to answer. But it's much easier to say those are the 3 that are not, and everything else is considered suspect.
Maybe, Ryan, if you could just mention like the top 5 that are most likely to contain asbestos, basing on experience.
I would say that in a regular home, or your home's different than a commercial building. The things that most often are asbestos containing are the interior drywall materials, interior flooring materials, heating system, insulating materials. Those are the ones that very regularly come back with asbestos in them. And you said 5. So, you could throw in there roofing. Roofing quite often has asbestos, but again, not as often as these other first materials that I mentioned. A lot of the other materials, stuccos and plasters, those are definitely worth testing rather than just presuming them to be positive, because quite often those come back negative. But again, they're a suspect material.
Joint compound can fix something that more often than not contain asbestos?
So it is, I would say, when I compare it to other types of drywall, I find it much more regularly. Every other one just about will find it in the sheetrock joint compound, and all of the makeup of that kind of wall. In that type of wall, you have your drywall board, you have your joint compound mud, you have your tape, then you have a texture mud on top of that. And in residential settings, most often when we find it, it's in the joint compound. It's not very often that we find it in the actual sheetrock until we start moving into fire corridors in a commercial structure. And in your particular buildings there, you guys have concrete block fire breaks in between. It would be highly unusual to have actual sheetrock with asbestos. But as we know, there's very potentially asbestos in the joint compound. I know that there is in at least one unit there. Any other questions on materials? Okay. So the next question I see, Mark, is asbestos found in nature or naturally occurring, and where does it come from? Yes, asbestos is a mineral. There are many different forms of asbestos. Mostly what we see here in the United States is chrysotile, and it is the California state rock is serpentine. So we have many, many areas across the state that are serpentine rock. Unfortunately, as an asbestos consultant, what they have done in the regulations is I'm not even allowed to test for naturally occurring asbestos. You have to have a registered geologist, but there are a lot of maps out there that you can just, Google and look for naturally occurring asbestos. And there are EPA maps, US maps, there are maps of California. There are a lot of agencies, San Francisco being one, that are trying to get more detailed maps of where naturally occurring asbestos is in the Bay Area and throughout the United States. Any other questions on naturally occurring asbestos? Okay. Next question I see is, what are the regulations in the San Francisco Bay Area around asbestos, such as with regards to doing work, and what kind of work on buildings with asbestos? So, like we started out talking about here in the Bay Area, Bay Area Air Quality Management District is the agency that enforces the EPA rules and have some of their own rules that are more stringent than EPA. And Bay Area Air Quality is the agency that covers building owners and requires building owners to test for asbestos. It requires building owners to notify when they are doing demolition activities. It requires building owners to notify when they are doing asbestos abatement. And they also govern the transport and disposal of asbestos. And the reason that's so important that it covers those areas is because the liability for that lands on the building owners. OSHA and Cal OSHA is the agency that deals with contractors. So as soon as there's asbestos and someone is hired, if you hire someone, then now that person that you've hired, whether it's someone to test, like a consultant like me, or a site surveillance technician that works under me, or whether it's a contractor that's going to do removal, they have to be registered and licensed asbestos abatement contractors or asbestos consultants, site surveillance technicians. I know somewhere else in the questions, I'll kind of piggyback this. It is not legal for a contractor dealing with asbestos to take samples and provide health and safety advice for compensation. That is not legal. It is both in the California Professions Code and it is also in Cal OSHA. There are very, very few circumstances that a contractor can test asbestos, and that is only for their own worker protection, and they have to also be a certified building inspector. That's very clear in the regulations, and a lot of times out there in the real world, that's not what happens. There are contractors out there taking samples and providing health and safety advice, but that is not legal. So those are the main regulations for most residential and commercial buildings. The other major regulation that kicks in your K through 12 schools, not for profit, is what's called a HERA, which is the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act. It comes under the Federal Registry 40 CFR 763, and that is one place federally and in California that requires buildings that are occupied even for administrative purposes to inspect for and document asbestos-containing materials and to have a management plan in place on how they are going to deal with those asbestos materials in place. Those are the three main regulations that you would deal with for asbestos. So here I've got our inspections.
Right. Quick question. This is Bertrand again. Can you elaborate a bit more about, you started talking about owners and their obligations,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I assume this applies to cases of like landlords, I guess, and the renters vis-a-vis the renters, or I would imagine the owners of commercial buildings vis-a-vis the business that lease those buildings. Do you have any experience? Do you have any opinion, anything to share about how, like, what is the ownership? How does ownership question comes into play for an arrangement such as ours, which is a homeowners association?
So I can't speak much to real estate law. my very limited understanding of real estate law is that if someone knew or should have known that there was a potential of asbestos, it has to be disclosed. Now, quite honestly, my opinion of what someone else should know is going to be very different from somebody else's position on what they should have known. And I'm not an expert with real estate law, but when it comes to a building owner being responsible for identifying their asbestos, it is a Bay Area air quality management regulation for a building owner to determine the amount, quantity, and location of asbestos when they are going to do a renovation or demolition project. So while an enforcement agent could come on site and choose to cite the contractor rather than the building owner because they may feel that that contractor should have better directed the building owner, they can cite the consultant on site. Um, the letter of the law would say that the owner of the building is absolutely as responsible as anyone else. And in the real world, I don't agree, in terms of a lot of building owners really seem to just not know. But as far as the regulation, if you're going to hang your hat on it, the building owner is responsible for doing those surveys and determining the quantity, presence, and location of asbestos in their buildings.
Yeah, that's right. I get that. I mean, maybe that's a good clarification. I think what I'm trying to elucidate is if you have any experience, any clarifications for us about, in the context of an HOA, who is the building owners? Like one interpretation I imagine would be what is shared ownership. Like, I have my 0.75% of co-ownership of the overall condominium, and I am a building owner as much as my 138 co-unit owners. And in particular, of course, in this instance, there's an open question of what does the association itself have any particular obligation under the, related to that standard about the building owner's obligations.
Right. And I think I kind of better understand your question. And there is also language in that regulation about the controller of a project or of a building or of a renovation project. So in my mind, because I'm not very familiar again with a bunch of real estate, laws and the intricacies of that, but a lot of times when I have to deal with an HOA in a circumstance like this, or in a community where the HOA is usually responsible for the exterior of the building, where an individual owner is then responsible for the interior of the building, has been my experience. And so in that circumstance, if a project is going to take place, say on the exterior of a building, say they're going to impact the stucco, in my view, the HOA and that building owner holds some responsibility there. Now, the majority of the responsibility may land on the HOA if the homeowner is saying, well, look, we don't have any control over that. We have to follow the direction of the HOA. A lot of times it comes down to the enforcement agent that shows up, and they may make the determination that they hold the HOA more responsible. They may make the determination that they hold the contractor more responsible. So some of the, say, percentages there of who's assigned what liability would come down to the enforcement agent on a particular project. But I, in my opinion, an HOA who controls the exterior of the building would absolutely be responsible for any activities that are impacting the outside of that building that they have any control of.
Okay, thank you.
Did that answer the question or make it more confusing for you?
I happen to have spent the whole day today for work with a bunch of lawyers, and there's a similar set of questions that could be come out of that. Like, was it more confusing at the end of the day than it was at the beginning? So who knows? But I appreciate you addressing the question. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So let's see. So I think we covered regulations, permits, or inspections or permits, other regulated activities required if work that's done involves asbestos. What if we don't expect work to involve asbestos? What if the work only covers a smaller area? So I think I touched on this, that both Bay Area Air Quality Management District and Cal OSHA have a more stringent rule of 100 square feet. And to be honest with you, I was always under the impression that is cumulative, and they have a new director over at the Cal OSHA Asbestos Registration Unit. And it was just clarified to me that they mean 100 square feet at any one project. So that's kind of why I use the example, if you're going to drill a couple of small holes, you probably don't need to hire an asbestos abatement contractor. But if the area is going to cover more than 100 square feet, say you're going to, do five different rooms, you've got to consider hiring an asbestos abatement contractor. But the technical answer is 100 square feet. Anytime you're going to disturb more than that, it has to be done by a licensed asbestos abatement contractor. Now, there is one loophole. I call it a loophole. And this is specifically for Bay Area air quality with the district that we're all residing in, because the federal EPA does not require single family homes to be covered under the regulation, but Bay Area Air Quality Management District does. The federal regulations kick in at 10 or more units per building, but Bay Area doesn't have that designation. Anything that's going to be disturbed that's a residence has to be tested for asbestos prior to disturbing it. And the permitting for asbestos abatement and for notification of asbestos abatement or just demolition, that all goes through Bay Area Air Quality Management District. The certifications for folks like myself or for contractors doing asbestos abatement, those certifications come through Cal OSHA. However, they refer to a HERA, the school regulation, which again is a federal regulation that requires the training be provided by accredited facilities that are laid out in a HERA. So some of these regulations kind of cross and blend together, which is, a little bit tough to follow. But most of your permitting for a building owner is going to be through Bay Area Air Quality Management District.
And so,
Or even asbestos.
So in this case, even if a contractor says, I'm just working on wood, glass, or metal or material that I don't think has asbestos, they don't get to make that determination?
So as far as inspecting, again, a contractor cannot test themselves. So as a certified consultant, I can go out and I can look at a piece of wood and I can say that's not asbestos. By regulation, a contractor cannot do that. Now, that may be a little bit like the speed limit, right? A lot of people drive over the speed limit. I'm sure there are a lot of contractors out there, and if they're disturbing wood and somebody complains to Cal OSHA may not send anybody out there. They may not show up to enforce it, but the regulation says that a contractor cannot, for compensation, provide health and safety advice or test for asbestos. And I guess I should clarify that contractors, if they are also a building inspector, can take 12 samples for their own worker protection, but they cannot use that as a survey to prove that there's no asbestos for Bay Area air quality or any federal regulations. Did that cover it, Mark?
Yes, thank you.
Ryan, this is Bertrand, and I have you actually are jogging, like making me now come up with a lot of questions. So if we follow the arc of what you've presented, you started with, okay, probably like anything in my home should be assumed to possibly be tainted with asbestos. As a homeowner, I have a responsibility, and I think I heard, if I hear you correctly, right, with respect to my contractors as well, to request and comment, or inform them of where asbestos might be, and proceed with abatement. Is that, do I understand those things correctly?
Yes. Now,
What's weird is that
in another. Yeah, go ahead.
what's weird is that doesn't correspond to my experience at all. I've done 2 fairly thorough remodels at my home, and nobody's cared to either request, require, enforce, or frankly, in any way appear to care at all about anything related to asbestos. And they did not ask me anything, but also did not require anything of me, did not inform me of anything, And so I'm wondering how to square this. And then basically, ultimately, are we saying that a conscientious contractor that I would hire for work on my home, might say, well, I would love to work here, but like, first of all, I need you to do abatement when necessary, and I cannot proceed unless you do so. And then that I, as a homeowner, then under all these regulations, have little choice but to comply. And is this really what we're talking about, or are we just all like blithely ignoring the law? And I mean, like, yeah, how do we think through this?
Yeah, unfortunately, I hate to put it that way, but yes, a good majority of contractors, and in my opinion, building owners probably don't know as much as contractors know. But yes, it's blindly not following the law. Now, it's understandable. And again, kind of like I used the freeway, how many people are going 65? Most of them are doing 80, and they're not all getting tickets. The thing is that, so forgive me if I get a little confusing here, but so one of the things that Bay Area Air Quality and the feds expected to happen was that your local building departments were supposed to let people know of this requirement when they apply for their regular little building permits. And that was not happening. It didn't happen for years. There were only about a handful of cities in the Bay Area that I could name that were doing that. Now I'm starting to see a lot more of those building departments come into that compliance and letting people know. But unfortunately, you're absolutely right. There are so many clients that I have dealt with that truly had no idea that they should even be looking for asbestos because nobody told them about it. And it's usually a hard stop when they find out, because it's usually an enforcement agent that shows up, and the enforcement is so little resources that usually enforcement comes about from a complaint. So, the neighbor doesn't like the noise, or the neighbor doesn't like that you're getting renovated and they're not. They call Bay Area Air Quality, and that's when they show up. So probably 95% of the projects going on out there have never even tested or looked. That is true. I see that out there regularly. And most of my clients come from one of 2 things. They, on their own, are trying to be safe, or there has been some sort of project that went haywire and they found out in the middle of it that, oh my goodness, this has asbestos, and now I'm concerned about my family or my employees. But you're absolutely right. There is not enforcement across the board, and that is what very often, I believe, brings it to people's attention.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So we are on what parts of the building have you seen in general that contain asbestos? I think we already kind of covered that. Really, if there's any question about that, you should test it before it's disturbed. What are ways where asbestos can be safely removed or encapsulated, such as it is not a safety concern? Is there a difference in how it can be removed and encapsulated depending on how it has been previously disturbed? So, yes, there's a lot of asbestos around and in good condition, in place, undisturbed, maybe with a coat of paint on it. It's not a risk to your families. It's not a risk that asbestos is going to slough off just because it's there. Again, in good condition, it is generally not a hazard. It requires disturbance or failure of a material. And that's the other thing that I'll mention is that in a lot of circumstances, paint is a good thing because it serves to encapsulate the material and not allow fiber release. A lot of times this comes in with ceilings or fireproofing that people ask me about. And the other side of that coin to keep in mind is that if you ever pick up a can of paint, it has weight to it. And the more weight that you add to a material, the more it's going to start to fail and want to fall down. The other thing kind of is this question, I read it kind of alludes to, I would never recommend if you have, a halfway torn up piece of pipe insulation to just coat it with paint and call it good. I mean, things really need to initially be intact and in good shape to then consider encapsulating them. And encapsulation is basically paint. In some cases, they use different types of penetrating paints for different materials when it comes to asbestos abatement. As far as removal, in most cases, it's an abatement contractor, it's wet methods, it's containment when possible, different work practices and engineering controls. How can I find the right type of professionals to approach the asbestos concern? Are they licensed or certified? Can I check on their credentials online? So, all companies and or individuals that are certified consultants like myself or certified site surveillance technicians that work under a CAC like myself or an asbestos abatement contractor, and even some employers like, say, hospitals that have their own abatement on staff and they only work in their own buildings. All of those entities or people are certified through Cal OSHA's asbestos registration unit. I do not know how well their website is adapted to, say, put in somebody's name and find out whether or not they are registered. But certainly anyone you're dealing with that claims to be registered should have a number for you to say, yes, this is my CAC number. Yes, this is my DOS registration number, that you can follow up with those agencies. Do the same people inspect for asbestos, remove them? I think I already covered that. It's absolutely illegal for me to go test and give you health and safety advice and then say, oh yeah, by the way, I can do it. I can do the work for you. That happened a lot before the HERA regulations came in. And, there are people that try to scare people into selling them work. And so that is absolutely not legal to do by regulation. Can anyone remove asbestos or handle or touch building materials with asbestos? I think we've covered that. It does require OSHA certification to disturb asbestos. What are the legal and disclosure requirements around documenting and managing asbestos in schools, public spaces, and for homes? So we touched on this a little bit, that building owners hold responsibility. As far as disclosure requirements, I can't speak to real estate law in schools, It does go a step further that parents, it's a legal requirement for schools to notify parents of the location quantities of asbestos in their schools. However, I've heard stories of, to meet that requirement, they may simply hold a PTA meeting and say, here's this one sentence that says we have it, and then they've covered their obligation for the year to notify parents. There's a lot of some, I'll say, building owners don't want to discuss asbestos with the people that are impacted because they're afraid that it's going to bring a bunch of hysteria and people being panicked and things like that. In my experience, um, people have a little bit more comfort level knowing and understanding what they're dealing with rather than just being left in the dark. But again, that's just my personal opinion from doing some training and things over the years. So public spaces and homes, again, it doesn't fall under a HERA except for the certifications. So the requirements to test and look for asbestos are really the air quality district regulations. The regulations for the employees kick in as soon as you hire someone, although it's the responsibility of the employer to provide these things. It's not the responsibility of the building owner to make sure that all of the employees were trained properly. That responsibility lands on the employer. What does the percentage of asbestos mean in a sample test report? How high is bad, or is there a safe level? So EPA says there is no known safe level. Many of the laws that were written for asbestos back in 87, they were based on what the laboratories could reliably detect to. They were not based on health and safety. There is no known safe level of asbestos. Now, it's been my training for 20 years and my understanding that the majority of the cases are from long-term, heavy exposure, workers coming home with thick asbestos on their clothes. That's not what we are dealing with today. But the issue to me is not as much of a quantity of asbestos as it is being improperly disturbed. I've done air sampling on projects where they were dealing with 0.1%, only in the joint compound where you barely have any asbestos, compared to a project that's got heating system pipe insulation being torn out that's at 80% asbestos. And when engineering controls are used properly or improperly, I've seen just as high readings come out of a low percentage material as a high percentage material when they're disturbed incorrectly. So it really comes down to work practices and engineering controls and wet methods to keep materials from getting airborne. Let's see. Next are California or Santa Clara County standards more strict than EPA or federal standards? Again, yes, that's Santa Clara. Santa Clara is covered by Bay Area Air Quality Management District. There are some air districts in California that are not quite as stringent, and there are some that are just as stringent or even more stringent than Bay Area Air Quality. But I would say that Bay Area Air Quality Management District is one of the more stringent districts out there. And as far as the OSHA standards, the same thing goes for that. Fed OSHA is not as stringent as Cal OSHA. And here, anywhere in California, Cal OSHA, the more stringent regulation is going to take precedence. If asbestos is found in bulk debris, but not in the air sampling, does it make it safer or not matter? So when I talk with clients a lot, air sampling is really good in a containment on an abatement project when you can do what's called aggressive sampling. That means everything's supposed to be clean. A consultant can go into that contained area and disturb the air with, fans or blowers or whatever they're using to agitate the air. And in that circumstance, air sampling is good and can give you good information. But I personally have had experience where I could set an air sample, a static air sample, on one side of a room and have a pile of asbestos on the other side of the room that's been disturbed and set in a pile, and run an air sample and have the air sample come up perfectly clean. Does that mean that I would say that it's safe to occupy that room? Absolutely not. That asbestos needs to be cleaned up. And for that reason, and along with that, as a certified consultant, I cannot legally do aggressive air sampling in an uncontained area. So unless it's an abatement project, it's not legal for me to do that. And because of that, I would say that, in my opinion, air sampling is not, this great tool, certainly for determining whether there's contamination, for determining whether a project is completed well, that's fine. But for determining whether work needs to be done, it's just not a good tool. I personally get way better information by doing a thorough visual inspection and doing bulk sampling. So it looks like that is the end of the questions that I have up here. Is there any more that I'm missing, or anything that I've... Okay, let's see. Why is it... why is it that due to asbestos found in an area, items such as clothing, fabric, textiles, electronics, appliances, fans have to be considered non-salvageable and disposed? So, in my experience, so there's nothing that says that you can't clean an item, but very often you have to weigh out. So let's just say that everything we're dealing with is contaminated and known to be contaminated. So by the time you pay an abatement contractor to clean an item, then you pay a consultant to test an item to get it clear. Very often it's less expensive to just replace that item there. And that's really with porous items. And where it really becomes difficult is with furniture, because an abatement contractor could HEPA vacuum a couch all day long, and I could take a sample on it and have it come up clear. Does that guarantee that there is no hint of asbestos in it? I don't know that I could provide, proof of that. And so very often a consultant that's taking on that liability will say, no, that has to be replaced. I come from the position that basically anything that's non-porous, plastic surfaces, wood surfaces that have a finish coat on them, those type of materials can usually be cleaned pretty easily by an abatement contractor. It's when you get into carpets and furniture and fabric items that are much more difficult to clean. And if you have a known contaminated space and you can't document and prove that an item is clean, then you, in my opinion, want to treat it as contaminated and replace it, get rid of it. I don't know that there's any regulation that says that you have to do that. But that's kind of, a lot of consultants in the industry, I believe, would agree with that position, that if you're going to try to salvage something that's porous like that, you would want something to back it up and say that it was cleaned adequately.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan. If you have any other,
I have one question.
yes.
Have we covered the question? What's the definition of asbestos abatement?
Oh, yes, Ryan.
The definition of asbestos abatement. I would probably have to look that up. I mean, Cal OSHA uses the term disturbance. So I would have to say that anything that disturbs an asbestos material would absolutely be considered abatement. And in some cases, even intact materials that are being taken out, say a cement pipe, that they wouldn't normally break, they would just wrap and take out and dispose of as hazardous waste, that would absolutely also be abatement. I don't know that I have the exact definition answer for you on that.
Well, would cleaning, that kind of cleaning with HEPA and wet wipe be considered abatement? Or would it more be like removing or sealing and encapsulating that's considered abatement?
So if there is known asbestos contamination, then I believe the different regulatory entities would consider that to be abatement. Now, the thing is that when you get deeper into abatement, there are different classes of work. So while cleanup of contamination, one might consider it class 4 work, and it may not need as many engineering controls by regulation, or they may deem it what's called pre-cleaning. So in the AHERA regulations, they allow for, and in some cases require, pre-cleaning of an area prior to the actual abatement, if you will. But it still has to be done by an accredited worker. It still has to be done by, really an asbestos abatement contractor. It wouldn't make much sense to send in a non-certified individual to clean up. And of course, if you know that there's asbestos there, I'm pretty confident in saying that Bay Area Air Quality and Cal OSHA would absolutely say that that would fall into that category. It's just what level of training would that worker need? Did I get lost on part of that question, or does that let you know that I don't actually have the definition for you?
I guess it's because we've seen the word abatement quite a bit, and so it's interesting to know what counts as or who can do it or what isn't abatement.
Right. And there, it really does, like, say if you take a school setting, it really does get into the class of work that it's going to fall under. Most activities are going to be large enough that they fall into one of the main categories of work. The Other than maintenance activity, the lowest one would be class 3 work, which is dealing with very friable, hazardous asbestos materials, but that they fit in one bag. Anything beyond that is going to require full-blown worker certification, regardless of the registration of that employer. And in my mind, because we go round and round with different consultants about this, in my mind, and the regulation is written as the debris from the cleanup fits in one bag. Well, in my mind, all of those materials that were used as part of the cleanup, any plastic that was put up, any of those materials all have to be considered debris. You can't just say, okay, it was just this dust that I cleaned up. The mop's contaminated, the ladder they were standing on needs to be cleaned. Those are not going to fit in one waste bag. So it would fall under a higher category of work, in my opinion. There are people that would argue that and say, our worker doesn't need to have any certification because we're calling it a maintenance activity. In classes every year, we have consultants that go back and forth on that. And that's just kind of where my position is on that.
This is a tougher question. Have you been in a position where different consultants have different opinions or different recommendations or guidances on a similar situation?
I would say that, so as consultants, we sit in certification classes, every year, and we certainly, go back and forth on some of these minute issues, just trying to get down to the letter of the law. But realistically, most consultants that I run into, and keep in mind that, it's not very common that I would be on a project that has more than one consultant involved. Because, if one consultant writes in the specifications, you need to use blue water, and I sit over here and say, no, I want you to use green water. It really didn't make any difference, but now you're having a dispute between what was written in the specifications. So typically, I'm used to projects having one main driver, if you will, one main consultant. Now, they may send out different technicians to do different sampling and things, but they are always supposed to report back to that same consultant. So again, Mark, I really haven't had any experiences on a project where I, as a consultant, had another consultant that didn't agree, with what our ultimate goal was. There may be some differences with experience where, I say, hey, you need to wrap that pipe with plastic, and they say, no, we can't wrap that pipe because, it's an electrical hazard and we have to wrap the whole box. I mean, there's always certain work practice and containment things that experience can lead you in a little bit different direction, but ultimately they have to meet the same regulatory goal, I guess.
I guess one of the things I can hear in summary is that in order to do a good test post abatement, ideally your place would be under containment and you could do aggressive air sampling.
Ideally, yes, for indoor work. I would say that there's one even higher on the list. And I try not to throw people or consultants under the bus. There are some consultants that I have seen that will go in and set up an air sample and say, the air sample came back, you're good to go. What I have been trained since my early days and what I pride myself on, quite frankly, and EPA lays this out. A clearance inspection, you can only run an air sample if it has passed a visual inspection, and then you can proceed with your air sampling. To me, the very most important part of an inspection, whether it be a clearance inspection, whether I'm going into a single family home because mom's concerned about the kids. No matter where I am, the visual part of the inspection is the most critical, is the most important. It gives me the most information on the condition of materials, where debris might be trapped, where if I just go in with the goal of saying, hey, I'm just going to take a wipe here and set up an air sample and the lab says it's all good, I could walk away and there could be a hazardous pile, in the corner that nobody ever noticed. And then, mom comes back in and runs her household vacuum across it. And all of a sudden your whole place is contaminated again. So, to me, it's just the most critical part is that visual inspection. And unfortunately, a lot of times I see that part of it getting overlooked.
But I realized we've hit about an hour and or plus. So does anyone have any further questions for Ryan? Well, and if not, with Ryan's consent, we recorded this, and it was ideal if you did not attend the full session because you joined later. Please feel to reach out to me, and I can make that recording available so you can catch up on that. And thank you. I just want to thank all of you for attending, and especially Ryan Compton for your generous time to give us this general education and Q&A on asbestos and safety.
Thank you, Mark, for organizing these things. And Ryan, all your input was very helpful to understand some of the nuance on the asbestos.
Good. Hopefully that was helpful to answer some of the questions, and not a problem. I'm happy to be able to help out.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks Mark. And if you have any questions or any follow-up, feel free to reach out to me. You've got all my contact. And everyone have a wonderful evening.
You too. Thank you. Bye.